Hello, my name is Emma, and today I am going to be sharing with you guys the books that I read for Diversity Bingo of 2017. If you haven't heard me or anyone else mention Diversity Bingo before, it was essentially a reading challenge for all of 2017 that was created on Twitter, encouraging people to read different diverse books featuring main characters from various populations. I had the absolute best time participating in Diversity Bingo this past year. I feel like it really pushed my limits as a reader and opened me up to so many different perspectives that I may have not been reading enough of, or maybe had never read from before, so I really enjoyed my time participating. But in total for Diversity Bingo of 2017, there were 36 different boxes or challenges to complete, and I ended up reading 25 of them, which is way more than I expected. From the beginning, I knew that I wasn't going to complete every single box for Diversity Bingo because I didn't want the aim to be to complete the reading challenge as a whole. I just wanted it to be an opportunity to give me ideas for different books that I was maybe missing out on, and I feel I really accomplished that. First up is a romance with a trans main character, and I read If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo, which is also written by a trans author, so it is an Ownvoices novel. I really enjoyed my time reading If I Was Your Girl. I believe this is the first experience I've ever had reading from a trans main character's perspective, and I thought it was so illuminating. Coming from the perspective of somebody who has actually experienced it, who is writing this story, it felt so authentic and raw, and it really delves into the struggle that trans teens experience, but also the happiness that comes from accepting yourself, and I think it was a really worthwhile read. I'm super happy I read it this year. The next book I read for Diversity Bingo is a science fiction fantasy novel with a disabled main character, and for that I read The Copper Gauntlet by Cassandra Clare and Holly Black, which is book 2 in the Magisterium series. Again, this is another one that I really enjoyed. As a spoiler alert, I pretty much enjoyed every book that I read for Diversity Bingo, but I really enjoyed The Copper Gauntlet, especially because I wasn't the biggest fan of The Iron Trial. Our main character's name is Call, and as a result of an accident when he was a child, he's had multiple surgeries on one of his legs, which has caused it to grow improperly, so it's a little bit shorter, and he walks with a limp. In science fiction fantasy, there is a gross misrepresentation of people with disabilities. They don't exist in these fantasy worlds, and I find that to be a real shame. Call is such a wonderful character with a brave heart, and I really love the role that his disability plays in this story because it's something that is constantly present. It doesn't disappear, of course, and I think it is woven into the story in a way that is so respectful, and I think it can be a real inspiration for a lot of middle grade readers, so I really enjoyed it. Next is a book with a Jewish main character, and for that one I chose Lair of Dreams by Libba Bray, which is book 2 in the Diviner series. If you haven't read the Diviner series, oh my god, it is so amazing. It literally would fill like 6 squares on Diversity Bingo. It is so freaking good. I love Sam so much. He just makes my heart flutter. He is like all of the things that we love about the broody, flirtatious love interest, but he's also such a genuine, wonderful person. Sam's faith is definitely a central part of his character. It comes up a lot in the story, especially as we are exploring his family history, growing up in a Jewish household where he's also the son of a Russian immigrant in 1920s New York, and it is just an absolutely phenomenal story with so many diverse characters and perspectives, and if you haven't read the Diviner series, you absolutely need to mark it on your list for 2018. The next challenge was to read an Ownvoices novel with an Indian main character, and if you don't know what Ownvoices means, all it means is that it was also written by an Indian author. It just means that the author is writing within their experience, and the book I had to choose for that one is When Dimple Met Rishi by Sandhya Menon. This book actually features 2 Indian main characters, and I really loved this one. I think it is like the fun, cutesy contemporary that I needed this summer. Indian culture is such a present theme in this story, and this is definitely one of those books where I'm reading about characters that I cannot relate to, but it encouraged me to go out and do my own research and look up certain things that were in the novel, and it was all around a very immersive reading experience. The next challenge was to read a book with a displaced main character, which means a person is forced to leave their home, whether it is due to oppression or politics or natural disasters, and so the book I chose for that one is Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard by Rick Riordan, as it features a boy named Magnus who is homeless after he lost his home. Granted, he lost his home in a magic-related incident, but I think it definitely still applies because the homeless population is never represented in YA, though it is something a lot of teens deal with, so I think for that fact it's really important. I loved Magnus Chase. I cannot wait to continue with the rest of the series. This is a book that I have been wanting to read for an extremely long time, and it did not disappoint. I do know there's also a Muslim main character in this story, and in the second book we are introduced to a gender fluid main character, which is so awesome. So I cannot wait to continue with this series with all of its wonderful diverse representation, with Rick Riordan's wonderful writing, this epic fantasy world, and I'm just really excited to continue with it. The next challenge was to read a book with a main character with an underrepresented body type, so I chose The The Upside of Unrequited by Becky Albertalli, which is again an Ownvoices novel, as our main character is also Jewish. There is a lesbian character and a pansexual character, and I really enjoyed my time reading this book. It's not my absolute favorite book of the year, but I did still find it very enjoyable and adorable, and I really liked the characters. We don't often get plus-size protagonists in books in general, and being able to read a story that isn't just about the main character's weight and not just being a characteristic of themselves was a really enjoyable experience. The next challenge was to read an Ownvoices book with a neurodivergent main character, so I chose Queens of Geek by Jen Wild, which features representation for Asperger's and anxiety, and a Chinese-Australian main character who is also bisexual with a black love interest. There's a lot to love in this book. Like The Upside of Unrequited, Queens of Geek wasn't my favorite book of the year. I had some issues with writing and dialogue, and there were parts of it that were very unrealistic to me, but the representation in this book is executed so well. My absolute favorite thing about Queens of Geek is the beautifully written passages about being a part of a certain population, whether that be having Asperger's or anxiety or being bisexual. There are just so many great themes that are tackled in this novel and handled appropriately. In addition to it being Ownvoices for the Asperger's rep, that also includes the anxiety rep and the bisexual rep. And I know this is definitely a very beloved book in the diverse reading community, and I definitely think it's worth a try. The next challenge was to read an Ownvoices novel featuring a bisexual main character, so I chose How to Make a Wish by Ashley Herring Blake. I loved this book so much. It is so wonderfully light and fluffy and cute, but also super dark in certain times. Grace's story with Eva is just so cute and heartwarming, but the fact that Grace's mom is an alcoholic creates a lot of conflict in the story. As someone who grew up in a household with an addict, I can say that this is definitely an accurate representation of being a child involved in that. And all of the relationships in this book are just so well developed and well executed, and I couldn't help but absolutely love this book. The next challenge was to read a book with a main character who has an invisible illness. So for that one, I chose Under Rose-Tainted Skies by Louise Giordano, which is another Ownvoices novel. Read a lot of Ownvoices books this year, and I'm very pleased about it. But it deals with agoraphobia, anxiety, OCD, and self-harm. Under Rose-Tainted Skies, another one of my absolute favorite novels of the year. Nora is such a great main character. I find her story so raw and relatable, and I am just so pleased that I picked this book up this year. 2017, for me at least, was like the year of Ownvoices mental health novels, and that is so important to me. So I'm so pleased that I started it off with one of the most amazing books I've ever read. The next challenge was to read a science fiction fantasy novel with a main character of color, and for that I chose Flame in the Mist by Renee Athier, as it takes place in a fantasy feudalist Japan. I think the plot of this book is very unique, and I did enjoy my time reading it. I clearly do not know as much about feudalist Japan as a Japanese reviewer, so I'm not going to be able to pick out any inconsistencies that may exist, but I do think it was a fun, entertaining story, and it is definitely a series I'm planning on continuing with in the future. The next challenge was to read an Ownvoices novel featuring a Latinx main character, so I of course had to go with They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. Adam is Puerto Rican, one of our main characters named Mateo is Puerto Rican, and our other main character named Rufus is also Latinx. Additionally, Mateo is gay and Rufus is bisexual, so the LGBTQ plus representation is Ownvoices as well for this novel. I absolutely loved They Both Die at the End. Most of these books are on my top 17 of 2017 because they're all so good. The world of They Both Die at the End is just like so fascinating, and I can't express to you how wonderful of an author Adam Silvera is. All of his main characters are a part of the LGBTQIA+ community. Most of them are Latinx as well, and he's just such a phenomenal writer, and I can't wait to read more wonderful books from him in the future. So the next challenge was considered a free choice where you could choose any book as long as it was diverse, and because I love mental health recommendations and I feel like there weren't a lot of opportunities to read books specifically that dealt with mental illness, I decided I wanted to pick one up for my free choice, and that is The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness. This is also an Ownvoices novel, as our main character and the author deal with OCD, and there is a side character that also has an eating disorder. For the mental health representation, I absolutely loved The Rest of Us Just Live Here. This is one of my favorite portrayals of obsessive compulsive disorder that I've read. It's just so authentic and raw, and I also feel that the eating disorder, though it is a smaller part of the book, it was handled with care and very accurately, and that makes me very happy. The one thing I did not like about The Rest of Us Just Live Here, and this is a recurring theme with my Patrick Ness reads, is that I just didn't understand the paranormal-esque aspects of it. I went into this book with the impression that it was about this world where a bunch of people have superpowers, but this is a story about the people that don't have superpowers, and I just didn't understand the superpower aspect whatsoever, completely passed over my head, but nonetheless, I did really enjoy the mental health representation in it, so that's a positive. So the next challenge for Diversity Bingo was to read a book that is set in a non-Western but real-world setting. Now, it is very possible that I'm kind of bending the rules for this one. I tried my best to do research, which I will explain, but the book I chose is War Cross by Marie Lu. This book takes place in Japan, in Tokyo, and although it is a science fiction novel and there are things that are present in this book that aren't present in our real world today, it is only set 10 years into the future, so I think it definitely counts for a real world setting because it takes place in like 2027. For me, it was close enough to a real world setting, but the thing I struggled with was determining if Japan is considered a Eastern or Western country. In my Google research, I found out I am not the only person that has considered this, so that made me feel a little bit better, but I could not find any like concrete facts that determine if Japan is considered Eastern or Western because it is very modern and very industrialized, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's Western. So if you know better than myself, please feel free to correct me because I genuinely don't know if this book necessarily counts, but regardless, I loved War Cross. It was my second favorite book of the year, and I am just so enthralled with this series. It features a Chinese American main character, and Marie Lu herself is Chinese, and we have a Japanese love interest, and again, it's set in Japan, and I absolutely loved it. It's so cool that there are like so many amazing epic science fiction aspects to this story, but we do also have certain moments where it goes back to like very traditional Japanese values, and I absolutely loved it. If you haven't read War Cross yet, you absolutely need to. Alright, so clearly it's a different day. Basically, for the first time in 8 years making videos on YouTube, I was in the middle of filming and I was just like, I don't feel like filming right now. So here we are to finish this video. The next book I read for Diversity Bingo was for the Ownvoices square, and that is A Fire and Stars by Audrey Coulthurst. I'm sorry, a fantasy story about two princesses falling in love. I could not resist. I absolutely loved A Fire and Stars. It was definitely up there on my top 17 books of 2017. I have to say, Denna and Mare have absolutely changed the way I view YA relationships. Like, this is who I look for relationship goals in all other books that I read. Their chemistry is unlike any other set of characters I have read before, and I think one of my favorite takeaways from A Fire and Stars is that this is a fantasy world where homophobia does not exist, so the issue in the story is not that it's two girls who have fallen in love, but it's the fact that one is in love with the prince's sister, and I just think it was such a wonderful part of the story. If you haven't read A Fire and Stars yet, I would highly, highly recommend it. The next Diversity Bingo square was a West Asian setting, and for that one, I chose The Rose and the Dagger by Renee Athier, which is a sequel to The Wrath and the Dawn. If I am correct, I believe this book takes place in like a fantasy version of the Persian Empire. Please correct me if I am wrong, but I do know that it is a fantasy West Asian setting. I was definitely a bigger fan of the first book, The Wrath and the Dawn, but I really did feel like The Rose and the Dagger is a satisfying conclusion to this duology. I love the characters, the world is just so magical and breathtaking to read about, and the writing is unlike any other book that you could find on the shelves of Barnes & Noble. So I definitely think The Wrath and the Dawn is a series that is definitely worth reading. These aren't my favorite books in the world. I tend to forget a lot of information like as I am reading the book, but I think that is just how Renee Athier's writing style works with me. But nonetheless, it was an enjoyable book, and I'm so glad that I finished this series this year. The next square I completed for Diversity Bingo is to read a book by an author of color, and I read Shiny Broken Pieces by Sonia Sharapotra and Danielle Clayton. This is actually a book written by two authors of color, which is always enjoyable, and this book does feature a Black main character as well as a Korean American main character. I had a lot of fun with this story. Again, I think I do prefer the first book more, but again, it was a satisfying sequel. My biggest critique of this series is that there's so much drama in it to the point where it is so unrealistic, where these scandals and things would absolutely never happen no matter how competitive people get. But nonetheless, it is a very fun contemporary story. It goes into a lot of different discussions related to the dance world and how different minorities are portrayed in the dance world and how family relations among different populations exist. I think it's definitely worth the read. Yes, I had to film a third time for this video, but don't judge me because I just got home from the gym. Essentially, I had filmed this wrap up thinking that I had completed all of the books on my Diversity Bingo TBR for the year, and I managed to squeeze one more in very, very last minute. So for the challenge of read an Ownvoices novel with a biracial main character, I chose P.S. I Still Love You by Jenny Han, which is a sequel to All the Boys I Loved Before, as it features a Korean American main character. P.S. I Still Love You is another sequel that I didn't enjoy as much as the first book, which is kind of a theme with me, but overall it was really enjoyable. My absolute favorite thing about this story is the family dynamics. We have a group of 3 Korean American sisters, and they are just so sweet and kind and close to each other, and that's not a relationship we see a lot in YA. They're wonderful, but my main issue with the book was I just felt like the couple wasn't treating each other right, and I was very uncomfortable for a large part of the story just because it didn't sit well with me, and there was the introduction of a second love triangle that I did not care for. I spent a lot of this book thinking maybe I had just fallen out of touch with this story and I was too old for it after I had read the first book 3 years ago, but I will say most of my issues are resolved by the very end of this book, and I am currently reading book 3 and I'm really enjoying it. So I am super happy that I finally continued with the series this year, and I'm super grateful to Diversity Bingo because I don't think I would have had the motivation to pick this one up had it not been for this reading challenge. The next square in Diversity Bingo was to read an Ownvoices novel featuring a pansexual main character. Now, I cheated a little bit for this one, just this one. The book I chose for this square is not Ownvoices, but because I did read so many Ownvoices books that were not required by the challenge, they just happened to be Ownvoices, I think it kind of balances out, so like don't hate me for it. I just want to celebrate one of the books I really enjoyed this year that had a pansexual main character, and that is 7 Ways We Lie by Riley Redgate, which in addition to having a pansexual main character, there is an asexual, aromantic main character that is not disclosed in text, but the author has confirmed it out of text, and it is fairly prevalent in the story. This book is so fun, and I don't understand why more people haven't read it. It is essentially a book about 7 different characters that all represent one of the 7 deadly sins, and it takes place over the story where they are trying to investigate a supposed relationship between a teacher and a student. All of the characters in this story are just so intriguing. Not only are they extremely realistic, like this is definitely a depiction of 7 different types of teens that do exist in real life, but there are some that you really love and there are some that you do not like, and I just think it creates a really interesting dynamic. Overall, super fun contemporary story. Please read it. I cannot recommend it enough. Next challenge for Diversity Bingo is to read an Ownvoices novel with a Black main character, and for that one I of course chose The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I loved The Hate You Give so much, I read it twice this year. I wrote a paper on Star for my Psych of Women class, and I just cannot get over how much I love this book. Again, very top of my favorite books of 2017. Just so many great diverse books in this list. I love it. This book is powerful and enlightening and inspiring and empowering, and there are just so many positive emotions that come from The Hate You Give, which of course it also does deal with very dark themes like police brutality and racism, but it analyzes it through such a critical lens that I feel like this is a book that absolutely everyone should read. I'm sure y'all have heard me talk about The Hate You Give enough. It is amazing. If you haven't read it yet, put it on your list for 2018, and be sure to keep a lookout for the sequel on the come up, which is also coming out later this year. Next challenge for Diversity Bingo was to read an Ownvoices novel featuring an asexual main character, and for that one I chose Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna McGuire. This book really embodies the term small but mighty. It is very short but absolutely amazing. So this book does feature an asexual protagonist, and I've heard nothing but rave reviews about the representation, especially because it is coming from an asexual author, but there is also a side character who is trans that I feel was also portrayed well. It's a fabulous story. It's a fabulous series. There are a bunch of different installments, one that is coming out in January where they follow different characters from Every Heart a Doorway, and there is other various representation in those stories, so I would highly recommend the Wayward Children series. The next challenge for Diversity Bingo was to read a book with a main character of color who is also a part of the LGBTQIAP+ community, and for that one I chose The Nowhere Girls by Amy Reed. This book is extremely diverse. We have one main character named Grace who is plus size. We have another character named Rosina who comes from a Mexican immigrant family who identifies as gay, and we have another main character named Erin who has anxiety and Asperger's. And these 3 girls start an anonymous group called the Nowhere Girls, where they are aiming to bring awareness to rape, sexism, and misogyny in their school after one of their classmates was raped and no one did anything about it. This book is so good. I can't rave about it enough. From what I have learned from participating in Diversity Bingo and from conversing with other members of this community that also speak about representation, I feel everything in this book has what people are asking for in literature in regards to representation, whether it be with a plus size main character, with a queer main character, with a Mexican main character, with a main character with Asperger's and anxiety. All of it was just everything I have heard discussions about in the community, and although I can't speak for any of this representation, I think it came across well. Again, this is another one that was on my favorite books of 2017 list, but it is so amazing. I can't recommend it enough to you. Please read The Nowhere Girls. Next book I read for Diversity Bingo was for the challenge of reading a book with a main character who has a visual disability, and for that one I read Not If I See You First by Eric Lindstrom. I loved Parker as a main character. I think she is so badass and independent and blunt and tells it like it is. There is so much to love about this girl. I have to say this wasn't my favorite book of the year. I went in with a lot of high expectations reading about a blind girl on a track team, but a lot of the story, like the bulk of this story, is really about Parker dealing with one of her past ex-boyfriends re-entering her life, and it wasn't really what I wanted the story to be, but the parts that I loved about it are still things that I very deeply loved, and that's a wonderful thing. The next challenge for Diversity Bingo was to read a book with a person of color on the cover, and for that one I chose Not Otherwise Specified by Hannah Moskowitz. Our main character's name is Etta, and she's a black teen who is bisexual and dealing with recovering from an eating disorder, and I do know that the bisexuality rep as well as the eating disorder rep in this book is Ownvoices. I really enjoyed this story. Otherwise Specified Feeding Your Eating Disorder is not one that gets any representation in media whatsoever, so it was so wonderful to see a book that portrayed that accurately. This book definitely brings a lot of different conversations to the table in regards to biphobia and being bisexual and being black and having an eating disorder and being in eating disorder recovery. There is so much heaviness in this book that is compensated with Etta's lightheartedness and how funny she is, and that was a really great dynamic to read about. I will say in reading reviews for this book, I've noticed a lot of people claiming that it promotes lesbophobic ideals in the way that Etta's friends who are lesbians treat her and the way that Etta responds to them and whatnot. So that's not something I can speak to, but I think it's something that's important to talk about regarding this book. Overall, it was a very diverse and different read, and it is a book that I would recommend to you if any of those parts of Etta's identity identify with you. The next book I read for Diversity Bingo was for read a book with a main character who is deaf or hard of hearing, and for that one I chose Your Welcome Universe by Whitney Gardner. This book is all about a deaf Indian American teen named Julia who is kicked out of her school for the deaf and mainstreamed. I absolutely loved this book, and I'm going to be honest, I actually forgot to include it on my top 17 of 2017 list. It was sitting on my bookshelf and I had every intention of including it. I could not, but it is one of my favorite books of the year. This book also features like the cutest friendship between two girls I have ever read about. It is so precious and fluffy and wonderful, and I would highly, highly recommend this book if you're looking for something that is a little bit different than I feel like what we normally have in YA. It was fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough. Next on the books I completed for Diversity Bingo is to read a book with an immigrant or refugee main character, and for that one I read The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicola Yoon. This book takes place across a span of one day where our main character is a Jamaican immigrant whose family is being deported after she meets a Korean American boy. This book was just so wonderful and adorable. The shenanigans that Natasha and Daniel get into are so wonderful, and although it does feature a love story that takes place in one day, it doesn't feel like the typical insta-love. It's told through so many different and interesting perspectives that I feel like we wouldn't normally think about in a book that really just adds to the story. So I really loved The Sun Is Also a Star, and I would highly recommend it to you guys. And so the final book I read for Diversity Bingo of 2017 is to read an Ownvoices novel featuring a hijabi main character, and for that one I chose Does My Head Look Big in This by Randa Abdel Fattah. This book is basically the story of an Australian Palestinian teen named Amal who decides to wear the hijab for the first time at her private school. There's so many different portrayals of people expressing themselves as a Muslim, whether they are hijabi, whether they choose not to wear the hijab, maybe they reject their religion and their Arab culture entirely. There's so many great passages of Amal talking about her faith and her dedication to being a Muslim that were so heartwarming. I couldn't help but smile while reading. The one problem that I really did have with this book is that there is a plus side character who has very, very unhealthy attitudes towards her weight. This character absolutely has problems with her eating, and there are a lot of insensitive comments made towards eating disorders. There are unhealthy behaviors that are so brushed over, and the end of the story there is no resolution to this portrayal. So personally that made me very upset, but that doesn't take away from the fact that this is such a groundbreaking story for so many Muslim teens. Like, going through the reviews, this book really impacted so many people's lives, and that's an amazing thing. So I'm overall very, very pleased I read it this year. So that really concludes my wrap up for Diversity Bingo of 2017. Definitely let me know in the comments below if you participated in Diversity Bingo. What were some of your reads? What did you think of the books you read? Have you read any of these books, and what did you think of them? I would absolutely love to know. But that is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you soon for a new one. Bye!